Chapters 19 and 20 of The Way of All Flesh. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman. The Way of All Flesh by Samuel Butler. Chapter 19. This much, however, we may say in the meantime, that having lived to be nearly 73 years old, and died rich, he must have been in very fair harmony with his surroundings. I have heard it said sometimes that such and such a person's life was a lie. But no man's life can be a very bad lie. As long as it continues at all, it is at worst 9/10 of it true. Mr. Pontifex's life not only continued a long time, but was prosperous right up to the end. Is this not enough? Being in this world, is it not our most obvious business to make the most of it? To observe what things do bona fide tend to long life and comfort, and to act accordingly? All animals except man know that the principal business of life is to enjoy it. And they do enjoy it as much as man and other circumstances will allow. He has spent his life best who has enjoyed it most. God will take care that we do not enjoy it any more than is good for us. If Mr. Pontifex is to be blamed, it is for not having eaten and drunk less, and thus suffered less from his liver, and lived perhaps a year or two longer. Goodness is naught unless it tends toward old age and sufficiency of means. I speak broadly, and acceptus excipiendis. So the psalmist says, "The righteous shall not lack anything that is good." Either this is mere poetical license, or it follows that he who lacks anything that is good is not righteous. There is a presumption also that he who has passed a long life without lacking anything that is good has himself also been good enough for practical purposes. Mr. Pontifex never lacked anything he much cared about. True, he might have been happier than he was if he had cared about things which he did not care for, but the gist of this lies in the "if he had cared." We have all sinned and come short of the glory of making ourselves as comfortable as we easily might have done, but in this particular case Mr. Pontifex did not care, and would not have gained much by getting what he did not want. There is no casting of swine's meat before men worse than that which would flatter virtue as though her true origin were not good enough for her. But she must have a lineage, deduced as it were by spiritual heralds, from some stock with which she had nothing to do. Virtue's true lineage is older and more respectable than any that can be invented for her. She springs from man's experience concerning his own well-being. And this, though not infallible, is still the least fallible thing we have. A system which cannot stand without a better foundation than this must have something so unstable within itself that it will topple over on whatever pedestal we place it. The world has long ago settled that morality and virtue are what bring men peace at the last. "Be virtuous," says the copybook, "and you will be happy." Surely if a reputed virtue fails often in this respect, it is only an insidious form of vice, and if a reputed vice brings no very serious mischief on a man's later years, it is not so bad a vice as it is said to be. Unfortunately, though we are all of a mind about the main opinion that virtue is what tends to happiness, and vice what ends in sorrow, we are not so unanimous about details. That is to say, as to whether any given course, such we will say as smoking, has a tendency to happiness or the reverse. I submit it as the result of my own poor observation that a good deal of unkindness and selfishness on the part of parents towards children is not generally followed by ill consequences to the parents themselves. They may cast a gloom over their children's lives for many years without having to suffer anything that will hurt them. I should say then that it shows no great moral obliquity on the part of parents if within certain limits they make their children's lives a burden to them. Granted that Mr Pontifex's was not a very exalted character. Ordinary men are not required to have very exalted characters. It is enough if we are the same moral and mental stature as the main or mean part of men, that is to say, the average. It is involved in the very essence of things that rich men who die old shall have been mean. The greatest and wisest of mankind will be almost always found to be the meanest, the ones who have kept the mean best between excess either of virtue or vice. They hardly ever have been prosperous if they have not done this, and considering how many miscarry altogether, it is no small feather in a man's cap if he has been no worse than his neighbors. Homer tells us about someone who made it his business always to excel and to stand higher than other people. What an uncompanionable, disagreeable person he must have been! Homer's heroes generally came to a bad end, and I doubt not that this gentleman, whoever he was, did so sooner or later. A very high standard again involves the possession of rare virtues, and rare virtues are like rare plants or animals, things that have not been able to hold their own in the world. A virtue to be serviceable must, like gold, be alloyed with some commoner but more durable metal. People divide off vice and virtue as though they were two things, neither of which had with it anything of the other. This is not so. There is no useful virtue which has not some alloy of vice, and hardly any vice, if any, which carries not with it a little dash of virtue. Virtue and vice are like life and death, or mind and matter, things which cannot exist without being qualified by their opposite. The most absolute life contains death, and the corpse is still in many respects living. So also it has been said, "If thou, Lord, wilt be extreme to mark what is done amiss," which shows that even the highest ideal we can conceive will yet admit so much compromise with vice as shall countenance the poor abuses of the time, if they are not too outrageous. That vice pays homage to virtue is notorious. We call this hypocrisy. There should be a word found for the homage which virtue not unfrequently pays, or at any rate would be wise in paying, to vice. I grant that some men will find happiness in having what we all feel to be a higher moral standard than others. If they go in for this, however, they must be content with virtue as her own reward, and not grumble if they find lofty quixotism an expensive luxury, whose rewards belong to a kingdom that is not of this world. They must not wonder if they cut a poor figure in trying to make the most of both worlds. Disbelieve as we may the details of the accounts which record the growth of the Christian religion, yet a great part of Christian teaching will remain as true as though we accepted the details. We cannot serve God and mammon. Strait is the way and narrow is the gate which leads to what those who live by faith hold to be best worth having, and there is no way of saying this better than the Bible has done. It is well there should be some who think thus, and it is well there should be speculators in commerce, who will often burn their fingers, but it is not well that the majority should leave the mean and beaten path. For most men and most circumstances, pleasure, tangible material prosperity in this world, is the safest test of virtue. Progress has ever been through the pleasures rather than through the extreme sharp virtues, and the most virtuous have leaned to excess rather than to asceticism. To use a commercial metaphor, competition is so keen, and the margin of profits has been cut down so closely, that virtue cannot afford to throw any bona fide chance away, and must base her action rather on the actual moneying out of conduct than on a flattering prospectus.